Hello, I'm your host, Kwame Ennis, and welcome to the People's Forum. Hello, America. I'm your host, Kwame Ennis, and we're back with the author, Shawn Rochester, and we're going to be picking up where we left off on his phenomenal work, The Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America. We're going to deal with the numbers, not the emotion, of what it actually costs, starting in 1619. Without further delay, Shawn.
Thank you very much for having me back on the show again. It's a pleasure and it's an honor. The Black Tax, as we may know, is about the financial cost of discrimination in America against Black people in particular. And while that tends to be an emotional kind of conversation, I want to look at it from a numerical perspective and what does research and the data say about it. And one of the things it helps us to do and understand is explain how we wound up in the position that we're in right now. And more specifically, when I say that position, I mean only owning about 2% of U.S. wealth after being here for 400 years, and there being over 40 million of us, right? It's a particularly profound thing. So one of the first things for us to do when we think about that is we have to start and take a look back over the time of slavery. And we look at things from the perspective of what was the impact of discrimination, and also what was the ability for people to accumulate wealth during that time, right? And if you think about the period of slavery, you know, there's many things that we could never put a price on, right? Okay. We could never put a price on what it is for a woman to not be able to control her body for the entirety of her life. We could never put a price on what it is for a man not to be able to protect his daughter or his son or his mother or his wife, right?
Or himself,
a partner,
for that matter.
For himself. Effectively not be a man, right? But what we can take a look at is the cost of the labor extracted from millions of people over a 250-year period. And economists have done that. Some put that number close to 24 trillion, others put it as high as 97 trillion. If you assume the truth is somewhere in the middle, we're talking about up to $50 trillion of economic impact. And that is extracted from those folks.
Who had nothing.
Yeah, who had nothing, right, by definition. And then reinvested into other people, right, that were not them. And that's a powerful and profound and even a scary thought. It's hard to fathom, you know, that kind of number. But even if you pivot and you say, all right, well, what else could you price from that time? And you could price the people themselves. Exactly. Because if you're in 1860 now, right before emancipation, you got 4 million people in bondage, right? And those people are the most liquid asset in America, right? They represent 50% of the full value of the South, of the wealth of the South. And the numbers are so...
And in terms of the world and what they produced.
Absolutely. They produced 80% of the global cotton, raw cotton, all around the country, which represented 61% of U.S. exports. 61%, right? So if you try to measure them as economists have, they're so large, you have to look at it either in terms of total U.S. wealth, right? So they represented about 16 to 20% of total U.S. wealth, or national income, or GDP. Right? Which is 1 to 2 years of GDP. Now, if you put that in perspective, U.S. wealth today, if you want to look at it in today's terms, about 85 trillion. So you're talking about those people representing between 14 and 17 trillion in today's dollars, right? If you take an average, that's 15.5 trillion. That's their equivalent. If you take it from the route of income, national income, you're talking 1 to 2 years, right? Well, national income's around 19 trillion. So you're talking about between 19 and 38 trillion. If you take an average, you're at 28. So one method of valuing them puts them close to 16. Another one puts them close to 29. If you take an average between the two, we're at $22 trillion. And what that says, and the point here, is that no matter how you look at it, we're talking about massive, gargantuan, hard to comprehend numbers.
And so, you cover all of that in your book so eloquently. Can I have the book on the screen, please? Go ahead.
And it's all tied to the researchers that have, you know, calculated, right, and did these estimations about what these numbers are. So when you start to think that it was a long time ago, yes, it was. The implication of that thought is that it wasn't that big of a deal. And for that to be...
But that thought is out of context.
Completely out of context. The implication of not being a big deal is that it was a small number, right? We lose $5 on our total wealth, not that big a deal. Lose 5 million, big deal, right? If it's not that big a deal, it's hard to say that when we're talking 50 trillion. It's hard to say that those people didn't do much and didn't contribute much, but yet they would be worth the equivalent of $22 trillion.
And when you put that 50 trillion next to other nations' GDP, it dwarfs it.
Yeah. It's a phenomenally massive impact, right? It's actually very consistent also with, if you look at Europe at the time and their colonial holdings and power, which most of it was driven off of slavery, expropriation of land, right, free land, and then the slavery that worked it, those holdings were worth 1 to 2 years of their national income. So Europe had an external series of colonies. America had an internal colony.
Yeah, I think the quote is that the sun never sets on the British Empire.
Yeah, you know, and it didn't.
Being from one side of the world to the next. Can you take us from 1619 to 1890? And I'm going to come along with probably a series of slides as well, and I'll cue the control room. But please start us in 1619. What's going on in America at that time?
Yeah, so when you're in 1619, you have the arrival of the first enslaved people, right? People who were captured from Africa to the continent. We're talking about roughly 20 or so people. Individuals, right? Who are brought here in bondage, and they become the underpinnings of what will be 4 million people many years from now.
They're the test studies of whether or not...
It is very difficult to take a large kind of uncultivated, industrialized territory and turn it into a massive empire unless you have a way to lower costs. And one of the most...
If the costs are free.
Yeah, and if the costs are free, it's a powerful thing. Now, there's lots of things that have to be done in terms of laws and the like to make sure that you can have that steady amount of labor. One of the unique things about slavery in America is one of the few places where the birth rate was enough where you could generate new slaves internally without having to continually supplement it with slaves being imported. That's one of the few places. But, you know, you're starting with these 20 or so people, right, in Jamestown in 1690. But by the time you're talking about 1860, prior to emancipation, we're talking about 4 million people, an extraordinary level of increase. And you're talking about the work of those people being responsible for about 61% of all exports. Right, and then 80% of the global cotton market. And what many people don't understand is cotton was like oil. I mean, it was the first global industry. You had about 20 million people employed in that industry around the world.
I have a quick question. How did the cotton compare to the sugar? Because
far larger.
Far larger. Okay.
Far larger, right? You know, very little. There's sugar production here, but pales in comparison, right, to cotton. And you gotta remember, there's all kinds of context, right? When you start getting from like mid-1300s to the mid-1800s, Europe is exceptionally cold. The demand for clothing and warmth is extraordinarily high, right? And cotton doesn't grow in Europe, right? They're growing it in different areas, and they have the colonies exporting that back to the mother country where the industrialization is happening. And a lot of that is in the production of clothing, various levels. And then you have all the technology that's necessary to do that in more and more efficient ways.
That industry supports thousands of other industries that feed off of that.
So you've got the steam engine because you want to be able to transport it more efficiently. You've got the rail so you can transport it more efficiently, right? You've got the shipping industry to be able to transport it as well, in addition to the slaves, right? And all the technology that goes into shipbuilding. You've also got the financial industry that goes into the commercialization of all these
the
products.
capitalization and financing.
Absolutely,
The entire thing.
even the insuring of it. So you've got industry after industry that's being built on it, right? But the 20 million is associated with the manufacture of cotton in some way, right? That's not even the other people that have other kind of tangential. And very often it's easy to miss, or not miss, but we don't know that it had such a global impact, right? There are estimates that up to 1 million of those people lost their jobs when you had the Civil War happening, because it cut off the supply of raw cotton, right? And when you think about that happening, people can understand like why the value of those people was so high, right? Because they are the production, right? To be able to plant.
They're the steam or the muscle that drives the engine. Without them, there's nothing.
Absolutely. So it's so when you talk about that, you see it as a massive impact. You know, you fast forward past the Civil War, and war does what war does, right? It destroys everything, at least in the South, right? A lot of their industry was destroyed, right? A lot of land, a lot of buildings, so a lot of infrastructure was destroyed. So they're devastated. All the land is confiscated, right? Because they rebel against the Union. It is it's given back to them, right?
Well, but before you get to giving them back the land, could you speak to the fact that, you know, they fought the war. There were some 60,000 black soldiers at least on the Union side. What happened to the funds that those soldiers had invested in the Freedmans Bank?
Yeah, so the 60,000 that you're talking about, like during the period of Reconstruction, right? You had many things happening. One of it was the creation of a financial institution that would house black money.
Okay.
Right.
And it was not a black bank.
Yeah,
it
the
was just
Freedmans
called
Bank.
Freedmans Bank.
Yeah, it was not a black bank. Right. But over 60,000 black veterans, right, of the Civil War put their money into it. Right. And you have to have all this in context.
Yes.
When you start talking like 1870, which is around that era, black people own about 0.17% of U.S. wealth.
So
like
if you talk about
zero.
60 people receiving bi-yearly or quarterly payments from the government.
Yeah, it's their wages from being soldiers, right, and making their contribution to bringing the Union back together. The Freedmans Bank is mismanaged in a horrible way by the white people who run it. And it is not guaranteed by the federal government. And there's a run in a bank, and they wind up losing almost about $3 million. I think it's about $2.9 million at that time.
At that time.
At that time. So you have to put that in perspective, because that could be approximately around, it's the equivalent of losing 70% of black deposits in an afternoon.
In one afternoon,
today.
Which would mean it would cripple any group of people.
And not only financially cripple, but also really destroy trust in financial institutions doing right by the people who are putting money in there, amongst people who so much, horrible things have been done to them. I think it was Frederick Douglass said that the failure of that bank set black people back so much. It's almost like if you'd had slavery for another 10 years, right? That was the financial and impact, and the devastating impact psychologically in terms of what that did.
Wow, wow. We're going to take a short station break, but when we come back, we're going to deal with the fact that there are many phenomenal institutions, Harvard, University of Michigan, Stanford, that are doing studies on how these different tax or different situations occurred, what they actually cost, and what they meant. So it's not black people doing the studies saying this is what happened to us. These are actually most of these institutions, probably white institutions, that are doing these studies, telling us this is what was extracted and this is what happened.
Yeah.
So when we come right back, we'll pick up with the Is America Biased?
Here is my handle and here is my spout.
When I get all steamed up, then I shout.
Tip me over and pour me out. Oh.
It only takes a moment to make a moment.
Cheers.
Take time to be a dad today.
I see you mobbing over her. Let's go. Let's mob. Let's crawl. Let's crawl. Let's crawl. Hey, yo, we mobbing. Come on, girl. Let's crawl. Hey, yo, let's crawl. Hey, yo, let's crawl. Hey, let's crawl. Hey, yo, let's crawl.
Can I tell you a cat joke? Just kidding. Why did the girl ask the mushroom to dance? Because he was a fun guy. What do you call a pig that knows karate? Pork chop. So how does a tissue dance? Put a little boogie on it.
America, I have a question for you. Please search your conscience, but we're going to look at the data, we're going to look at the numbers, and we're going to ask this question: is America biased? Shawn D. Rochester.
Yeah, the question is multifold, right? Does bias exist? And I'm being specific in the kind of bias. There's many kinds of biases. I'm talking about anti-black bias, right?
Yes.
So is there bias against black people in America? The answer is yes. Is it substantial? The answer is yes, right? Many people have done studies on this. When you talk about explicit, like people know what they're doing, you're talking about approaching 6 in 10 Americans having like explicit bias, right? Anti-black bias. And when you're talking about the subconscious bias, like people don't know what they're doing and they're not actively trying to be biased, but they're making decisions that wind up being biased, implicit bias, those can be as high as about 75% of the population, right? And you've got, an institution like Harvard has studied that implicit bias for many, many years. They've had over 3.4 million people have taken those tests online, which any of our viewers, right, could do to test their own bias levels, anti-black bias. So the answer is, does it exist? Yes. Is it significant? The answer is yes. The other question is, well, how does that show up and does it matter, right? And what we've seen is it shows up in markets that are really critical to wealth accumulation. It shows up in the job search process, right? It shows up even in high-end careers. There have been a number of studies that have been done, on these things, which I talk about in the book.
Can you give us a couple of those studies, please?
Yeah, so there was a study done at the University of Chicago, and they wanted to get a sense of the bias levels in the labor market. So what they did is they created some resumes, and they had the resumes vary in what they called quality, right? So the depth of the experience, the prestige of the financial institution, so on and so forth. And they sent them out to thousands of employers who had real job openings associated with it. And what they did was they changed the names on the resumes, right, from white-sounding names to black-sounding names. And they wanted to see what happened. And the short version is, if for the resumes, same exact resume, nothing's different, but it has a black-sounding name, right, like Lakeisha or Jamal, they would get 50% less callbacks about the jobs. And this is a critical item because if you don't get a callback, you don't even get a chance to really share why you're a great fit for it and how things make sense and to convince the person.
Without a callback, you're not even in the room.
You're done, right? And then the other thing that they noticed was that like the level of the presence of the name mattered quite a bit. Even as you increase the quality, so the depth of experience, and the prestige of the universities, what they saw was if you had a white-sounding name, the callbacks went up 30%. Makes total sense. Person seems to be a better candidate to you. You're excited about talking to them. For the resumes that had a black-sounding name, no change, right? Statistically insignificant. They were no more interested in calling them back, right? The the name was so significant that you really needed incremental years of experience to overcome that, right? Approaching 8 years.
I have a question. So if culturally I'm from another country, if culturally I'm from Pakistan or India or someplace in Asia, and the name that I name my child reflects my culture, reflects my religion in many cases, has a historical significance. Are you saying that these studies are saying that that has to take a back seat,
These studies,
at least at these times?
These studies are saying very specifically that black-sounding names receive less interest.
Period.
Period. Even when you increase the strength of the application, it received less interest. And it's so significant that you need like 8 more years of experience to overcome that,
Yes.
right? There are other studies that were done to give you like a point. When you put other people into the mix,
Yes.
there's an interesting study that was done in Chicago. And I really like this study because they went out to businesses and they said, listen, tell us what skills are important to you, right? And if we find folks and we train them, it'll be on us. We train them to develop those skills in them. Will you be interested? And the answer is obviously yes. I like that. They asked the right question. Let me solve, what problem do you have? How can we solve it? So they found a group of candidates. They have the companies. They know what skills the companies are interested in. And the candidates work over the course of a year on these various skill sets. And they all improve, right, in these skill sets over that period of time. What they noticed from beginning to end was for every group of persons in there, their employability went up, except the black candidates.
You were black.
Right? So even when you went through it and your skill set increased, the desire to employ you didn't increase. But it went up for everyone else that was in that control group, right? You start to see a level of consistency that starts to flow through these things. And then there was a study, I think it was by Arizona State University, that kind of looked at callbacks. And what they found was the level of bias is so high in discrimination that, you know, a white candidate with a felony on it gets higher callback rates than a black candidate with no criminal record whatsoever, right? What we're talking about are things that are massive and substantial and hugely impactful and have a direct economic impact. Even the choice of name, if it appears to be black or African American, can have a substantial negative impact on the person who is evaluating it.
And this is for the average person as well as the high achiever.
Absolutely. You know, so you bring up a great question, right? Because you can say, listen, that's just regular folks. We're big dogs in here. Like, we're going straight to the top, right? We're going to be lawyers and doctors and software engineers and all those kind of things. And it was a study that was done. It was very, very interesting study. So they wanted to get a sense of discrimination in the legal field. So they created a memo. And in the memo, they inserted 22 errors, right? Errors in fact, errors in analysis of the fact, errors in spelling, grammar, right? Technical analysis, a whole host of things. And they sent them out to 60 different partners at major law firms. And one half of the partners, they told them that a white lawyer wrote it. The other half, they told them a black lawyer wrote it. What they got back was when the partners thought it was a black lawyer or white lawyer, the person got like a 4 out of 5. So about 80%. So that's maybe like a B minus, right? For something that has 22 errors.
Okay.
Right? Right? But when they thought it was a black attorney wrote it, it got a grading of 3.1 out of 5. It's a failing grade, right? That's like 62%. That's a failing grade. You do not pass go. In addition to that, their projections of this person being a great lawyer were very negative, right? Now, substantially different. If you look at the errors in spelling and grammar, there were 7 of those. When they thought it was a white person, they found 3, right? When they thought it was a black person, they found 6 out of 7. So 100% more errors. Same exact memo, no difference whatsoever. It's just who you're told wrote it. Now, while that's clear, because most people say that kind of thing doesn't happen, right? And it clearly lays out that it does happen. I think we got to take a step further and say, what's the financial impact of that, right? Because
over a career.
Over a career, because we're talking about 2 equivalent pieces of work getting very different valuations. So if you are deemed as putting together somebody who writes failing quality stuff, and the projections are low, it's unlikely that you're going to get on a partner track.
Yeah, and for those who don't know, the ultimate goal for all attorneys just leaving law school is, at some point, is to become a partner or have their own firm.
Yeah, many, that's a huge, wonderful goal, right? For a lot of different reasons, financially very lucrative. It's very unlikely that that person's going to wind up on a track to do that. Now, here's the thing. You can still do really well as an attorney and not be a partner. Let's be clear about that. But the difference between being a partner and not being a partner over a career could be 11 million after tax, right? Substantial. And again, we're talking about equivalent pieces of work. So the potential, the skill, everything is there, just different interpretations of and valuations on the work. Ask yourself the question this: what does that do to that individual's family, that loss of income? What does it do to the church that they're part of? What does it do to their community? What does it do to the nonprofit boards that they sit on? That has a massive ripple effect across our communities. Only about 2% of lawyers are, less than 2% of lawyers, right, who are partners are black. And I think about 3% of all lawyers in the country are black, right?
It seemed like consistently, as I read your work and read other work, that there's a 2% rule that applies here when it applies to us. That is holding us back in terms of wealth, legacy, and all those sorts of things that you speak about.
Yeah, but a great observation. So, and I saw the same thing as I was doing the research. It seemed again and again that in areas that were critical to wealth accumulation, we're kind of hovering around or being held to this 2%. So if you look at our representation of doctors, right? 2% of doctors are black males, 2% of black female of doctors are black females, right? If you look at the amount of spend, 2% of people working in the technology industry, super critical industry, right, are black. If you look at, you know, managers and whatnot in the financial industry, even though we spend well over $100 billion a year in that industry, 2% of the high-end managers are black. It keeps coming up again and again. 2% of the spend on black, and you know, supply chain spend for corporations are black. It just keeps coming up again and again, and you see it here as well. So you have this notion of our representation is hovering around this 2% in areas that are high growth, high income, and critical to wealth accumulation.
It's still 2%.
It's around 2%. And by the way, that's the portion of the U.S. wealth that we own.
Exactly, still 2%.
Right.
I'm going to have to stop right now. This has been a phenomenal half hour. I wish we could have had longer, but this data is so important to our community. It's so important to the world. It's important for the world to know these numbers and how they affect our community, because it affects how people look at us.
Absolutely.
So I appreciate it. I want to invite you back. Above all, I'd like to please put on the screen the contact information of where you can email and where you can follow up and read some more of Shawn's work. And just say thank you, and I appreciate you, and you know, all praises to you and your work.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you
I
very
really
much.
appreciate it.
Good night, America.